Welcome back for our final reading from Shiro Kano, Chapter 15, Triumph. Shiro Kano returned to his own people very quietly in September of 1942. His call had brought him back to his countrymen so that he could minister to them, not only in the middle of the cataclysm into which his nation had thrown itself, but especially on into the future, after peace should once again come to the world. Deliberately, he made his return as unobtrusive as possible. His problem had complicated. Before, it had been, on the one hand, following the dictates of a nation he considered wrong, sick, yet still my country, while on the other hand, following the gentle, wise precepts of the world's Redeemer. Now a third obligation concerned him, keeping trust with the country that had educated him, given him new opportunities, and expanded his horizon. While at Fort Meade he had written, "Thought all day of my American friends, the obligation and responsibility I owe to them." Back once again in the haunts of his youth, Kyoto, ancient city of peace, he returned to the home of his father. All he asked was that he be let alone so that he could teach and preach the gospel of peace while his nation was still at war. He was able to locate two trusted friends, Reverend Zenichi Murakami, his close ally in Sunday school work among the children. The other friend, Kano's spiritual father, Reverend Nobumi Isayama, with whom he served as assistant pastor, wrote, "Not only did Kano return highly educated, but we saw a greatly refined character. After returning to Japan, the greater part of his activities was devoted to teaching. During those war days, Christianity was bound hand and foot. He was discouraged about the condition of all the churches in Japan. They were under the heavy pressure of the government and were not doing very much for the Lord. Followers of Christ were being watched constantly as the war progressed. Some were actually arrested. One of the ironies was that Kano had come home to fulfill his call to preach. Yet, to keep his identity concealed, he preached only a few times. He was not as glad to be repatriated as he had thought he would be. At least he thought he came back too soon." At last, realizing that evasion was no longer possible, fearing that the call would come for combat service, Kano again faced a difficult decision. 1 year after his return, he joined the Japanese Navy as an interpreter and set out for the South Seas. But his ship was bombed, and he remained afloat for 8 hours. God alone knows his thoughts during that time. After being rescued, he returned to Japan, only to set sail again. "If you hear many things about Japan and the war," he had told his Michigan friends, "remember that somewhere there will be a Japanese young man preaching the gospel." Down in the South Seas he was at it again, even while battles raged over his island outpost. Once again he had extended conversations with a priest of Buddha and compared the salvation of Buddha with the salvation of the world's Redeemer. Interestingly, upon his return home, the priest hunted up some of Kano's friends, so impressed was he by his life and ministry. "Unless that fine fellow Kano can get away from those islands quickly," he warned, "he will be like the other men, caught in the flame of war to die." Kano had tested Paul's "all things" from Philippians 4:13 to the full. He had experienced poverty, hunger, shipwreck, bombings, imprisonment, renunciation, scrutiny by investigators of 2 enemy nations, testings of faith beyond the power of most to endure. Not 1 inch of his loyalties, ideals, nor faith would he surrender, though the cost be death. What was one more enemy, the most rewarding and the last? "Sometimes it seems to me," he wrote home, "that the plains fall like the leaves of a tree swept by the wind. A natural process, leaves of a tree returning to the bosom of the earth that had nurtured them, of the soul returning to the bosom of God, who gave it life and clothed it with immortality." Early in the morning of January 19, 1944, In the Solomon Islands, Shiro Kano was hit by shrapnel from an air battle. He had kept faith with his Buddhist mother, who, in her own last hour, had said, "You have chosen a hard life as a preacher of the gospel, but do not give up your faith until your death." It is not length of mortal years that the Lord requires of a man, only the return to God of his immortal soul, clothed in the spotless robes of his righteousness. And so for Shiro Kano, his head unbowed in compromise or retreat, the hour of his death became the hour of his triumph. We can only imagine that he might have thought of these words again as life flowed from his body. "The Lord your God has carried you as a man carries his son." Deuteronomy 1:31. Epilogue. Today, on the former site of the old church in Kyoto, where Shiro Kano found the true God, stands the Shiro Kano Memorial Church, dedicated in June of 1958. The cross on its four-storied tower shines peacefully on the green of the woods surrounding the imperial palace of Kyoto. A trumpet note piercing through the chimes of a Buddhist temple summoned Shiro Kano to his first encounter with the true God. Kano's hand on the back of a fearful, bewildered young Japanese, John Kawamura, sent him searching for the word of life. Had a trumpet not blown in the Kyoto streets, had not an encouraging hand been placed on a shoulder, and this Shiro Kano Memorial Church might not be in existence today as a thriving Christian church. Both Shiro Kano and John Kawamura served in the armed forces of their country during World War II. John, who was not available at the first writing of Kano's life story, tells of an attempted meeting of Kano and himself in the South Seas. Kano, who longed to see his old friend, discovered that he was stationed at Rabaul, on New Britain Island, and went there to see him. In vain, Kano searched the airfield for his old friend. "But in the warehouse for the dead people's remains," John recalls, "Kano found all my baggage." He burst into tears and knelt down to pray that God, by all means, would protect Kawamura. Bitterly discouraged, he returned to his base in the Solomon Islands. I knew about this incident because he wrote about it to Reverend Nobumi Isayama. It is doubtful that Kano knew the other side of the story. The day before Kano had landed in Rabaul, John had left on a special mission to New Guinea. For a long time, Kawamura had no idea where Shiro was. "When I heard of his death," he said, "I could not lift my head. I said to myself, why didn't you pray harder for Kano? But it must have been an unavoidable accident, because I thought many times that I would have died during the war if God had not helped me." For Kano, life after his conversion to Christianity was a series of radical decisions that had to be made, and he faced them realistically with his eyes wide open. In 1927, the Japanese concept of the family was still that of a tightly knit unit. Shintoism and Buddhism prevailed as the traditional religions of each household. Kano broke the family pattern by embracing the Christian faith, and what is more, became a dedicated propagator of this gospel. In the army, he refused to pay allegiance to the national religion of Shintoism. In his day, when America seemed as far away from Japan as the moon from the earth, he left his family to study in a small holiness college in a suburb of Boston, and enlisted the financial support of his Buddhist brother to make it happen. He chose to work with his hands and thus further his education in America, rather than to go fight China. He risked repatriation and possible death so that he might suffer with his people and communicate honorably with them after the war. He did not disparage the family, nationalistic, and religious traditions of his country. Instead, he followed the call of Jesus and went cross-current to those customs. All anyone can do is the very best he or she knows and is able to do, in the light of existing circumstances and the evidence available at any given moment. The rest one must leave with God. A thought or a deed rarely dies with the thinking or doing. A pebble tossed into a pool sends ripples fanning out to the edge. The story of Shiro Kano has gone around the world. He still speaks to Japanese of all ages. In hospitals, his story has been passed from patient to patient. Missionaries in South America, India, Africa, the Middle East, and other countries have told young nationals of one who shared and solved their problems of choosing a religion and a way of life foreign to the religion and accepted ways of their culture. Sluggish, unmotivated young American students have read his story and become ashamed. Japanese Americans and native Japanese have attended Shiro Kano's alma mater, Eastern Nazarene College, because of his life and influence. Safety and security do not necessarily mean the approval of God on one's life. Any person is less than a person who does not have a conviction or two that he would be willing to die for. Sometimes the Almighty takes a person like Kano at his word. Wait a year, wait 10 years, 100 years, he would say. Wait for the judgment of history, the verdict of the passing years. Shiro Kano was living for more than the here and now. Only God and eternity will disclose just how far the ripples of Shiro Kano's life have gone. At least one ripple reached all the way to you. You've just experienced his story.